Alrighty. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming to the Symbiota Support Group May 2025 edition. Today we're gonna get started with a few announcements, and then we're going to pass it off to our SERNEC folks who have very kindly offered to help lead the discussion today. All right, so announcement number one, just a reminder, we're going to be at Spinach later this month. We hope to see a number of our Symbiota user community individuals there, and we're going to have a booth. We're going to be giving talks. There will be a demo. So hopefully you'll run into us since it's not a humongous meeting, but if you can't find us, come to the booth and we will be there and we'd be happy to chat. And similar announcement, we are also preparing for Botany, which is happening in Palm Springs at the end of July. Jen, Katie, and I will be there. We will have a booth, well, multiple booths actually. So if you can't find us at that conference, we'll be in the exhibitor hall, and we look forward to seeing everyone there. It'll be my first botany conference, so I'm particularly excited about it. And then we have another announcement. I think Katie wanted to cover this one. I'll pass the baton.
Yeah, way too many words on the screen. The point is, you guys have found and we have fixed lots of bugs. Thanks again for your feedback working with us on the Symbiota 3.2. We're already on our fourth, we call them hot fixes. It's like when all these bugs get together and then we release them in a hot fix. So we're already on our fourth hot fix. There were a bunch of changes that we had to make due to just the big changes that we made in Symbiota 3.2. So keep those coming. We're still fixing them. An update that Symbiota 3.3 is actually probably going to come fairly rapidly in the next several months, but it's going to be a much less major release. It's kind of like a lot of back-end things with like one or two new features. So it won't be as big of a like, whoa, Symbiota 3.3, there's tons of stuff. But you'll probably just be like, oh, that's slightly different. But of course, we'll keep you up to date when those are coming. But for now, thanks again for your feedback and for being patient with us as things that used to work break and then we fix them.
Thanks, Katie. And with that, we will get started with our presentation from the Southeast Regional Network of Collections and Expertise. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right, this is Herrick Brown. I'll, I guess, get started here. And just a minor note, so it's a Southeast Regional Network of Expertise and Collections. So
Thank you.
I know it's always been a mind-boggling thing, and even the acronym gets mispronounced sometimes. So I don't know, it's just um, something to talk about. At any rate, next slide, please. All right. So we'll start out with a little bit of background about the SERNEC project and then go into some of the modules that the TCN helped to develop within the Symbiota framework. Those namely being the skeletal data entry, and there'll be a little overlap with this and stuff that Michael's going to focus on in the Notes from Nature platform. And then we'll briefly touch on some of the post-funding activity, which includes the Penn grants, additions of more collections beyond the scope of the original project, and continued efforts to develop records in the Symbiota environment and sort of refining data standards. Next slide. And next slide, some reflections of what we've done. Okay, so the background on this is that the SERNEC project began as an NSF-funded research coordination network. And Zach could probably speak to some of this for sure because he was intimately involved in a lot of that. But initially, that acronym, being as confusing as it is, was even more muddled in its infancy because I think our scope was sort of pan-taxa. We were looking at every kind of natural history collection within the region. And through some of the meetings that that initial RCN supported, it was gradually pared down to just focusing on the herbaria within the southeastern U.S. And following that sort of narrowing of the agenda, we started putting in proposals, and I think we took like 3 times before we finally got a successful award from NSF. In scope and geographic scope, the project covers about 13 states across the southeastern U.S., and that region at the time included at least 233 herbaria that we had identified through the registrations with Index Herbariorum. The final project numbers, of course, were a few fewer states and a few fewer herbaria. But ultimately, we ended up with lots of work within that scope in a limited amount of time, as you know, any NSF project is time limited, which required a very efficient strategy to be developed. And from my perspective, I served as data manager. Michael was a project manager, and basically, we kind of jokingly referred to it as a lot of cat herding. And yeah, it's various co-PIs or PIs in their collaborating NSF projects would have different issues that we'd have to find ways of overcoming, even though we tried to come up with like a sort of generalized workflow. Everything was nuanced. And so that was cat herding, if you will. But that forced us to be adaptable and innovate new ways of dealing with the unforeseen circumstances that various collections were encountering. And then, sort of the take-home message here is that while we try to suggest, optimized or idealized workflows to accomplish the digitization of all these specimens, we were flexible in understanding that resources may have been limited at some of the partner institutions, and that we would have to modify those workflow protocols as required. So next slide, please. So some of the good things that we did. Now, again, we had that RCN that was sort of the preamble to the actual project here, but was listening to the project partners. Anyone that was a potential collaborator on the ADBC project had a voice, and some actually scored ADBC funding prior to the SERNEC project. Some of those folks that were within the southeastern region, namely Louisiana and Mississippi, which both had a project. Louisiana's project was called Cyberflora Louisiana, and Mississippi's was Magnolia grandiflora. Both of those emphasized a sort of image forward. In other words, they would capture digital images of the specimens up front, and then downstream of that, they would develop sort of a skeletal record from the specimen metadata. And a lot of times these budgets were very limited, despite the sort of enormity of the number of specimens that were queued for digitization. And this required relying on things like work study students to sort of extend the funds of those projects. And in order to sort of monitor activity, they had these sort of built-in timers or ways of logging the student engagement in their work. And at any rate, this sort of these ideas precipitated the development of a similar tool in Symbiota. And some of you may have used it, and I think I've got a screen cap of it in the next slide, if you want to go ahead and advance it. Or maybe not. Okay, at any rate, there's a little timer in there that kind of logs how long the student has been logged in, and it can generate a little bit of anxiety sometimes. So I tell my students not to worry about it too much. All right. One of the big things that we heard from our project collaborators was that pre-digitization, organization or curation prior to getting things digitized can really boost efficiency. And this would mean when you're grabbing a lot of specimens to queue for digitizing, that you have them sort of themed or organized in either a taxonomic similarity, or if they're geographically similar. And this can help in sort of the batch adding of upper level geography, or just the taxon names that are associated in the specimen metadata. All right, and then we'll talk about imaging forward workflows. Some of those would involve basically renaming an image file based from what your camera initially captured it as. And in there's an image only way of doing this, where you sort of rename the file based on the barcode and include the genus and specific epithet as part of the entire file name. And it essentially builds like a database of specimen images, or an image-based database, if you will. And from that, you can essentially read the file names to generate a spreadsheet using a short script, and then parse those names to create a skeletal file, which can then be uploaded and linked to your images in the Symbiota environment. Another option for doing an image forward workflow would be to just upload the images based on their file names being barcodes. That value gets mapped to the catalog number within the Symbiota environment, and then you can have students downstream from that call up the blank records and enter the data, the metadata from the image of the specimen label that's online. And then a similar workflow to that, and then Michael again will talk about this in a little more detail, is that you can upload these images, create blank records, and you can export those that record information to create a Notes from Nature project, and then have citizen scientists do the transcriptions for you, and then import those transcriptions into the database environment. And then lastly, there's these data forward workflows where, and these may occur in instances where a collection didn't have access to imaging equipment at the beginning of the grant period, or they may have had a collection that was in a technologically compromised facility. Let's just put it that way. So there were some cases where there was just no network connection in the collection space, so it wasn't practical to have this sort of imaging workflow coupled with the data development workflow. In either case, you could enter data just into a spreadsheet. And again, the pre-digitization curation comes into play here, where if you queue your specimens based on their geography, those sorts of things, some values can be sort of pre-populated within that spreadsheet. And then that sort of limits what student data entry technicians would have to do to just a few more fields, like if you wanted to include county or something below the state. Right, so I guess we can advance to the next slide now. Yeah. All right, so focusing more on these image forward workflows, essentially we had some collections that, again, did not have access to the like a computer to do the data development, or they were trying to sort of streamline the workflow so that they didn't have to do multiple points of data entry. And some of the software that we were using for the image processing would allow us to rename files and carry forward certain values in that renaming process. And so, for instance, you could set the software to have sort of a dynamic prefix, which would be the barcode value, and then the subsequent to, like I guess you would say an infix and a suffix, would be set to the generic name and whatever species folder they were dealing with at the time. And so they could essentially capture a few dozen images of specimens of the same species, and the only variable they have to change in the renaming of the file is the barcode value. And again, that builds this sort of a file name that is has those elements demarcated by a certain character, like an underscore or a hyphen or something like that. And since all of those files are then housed in a similar folder, you can essentially write a short script that will say, grab all the file names from this folder and put it into a text file. And then you can parse those file names based on those delimiters like the underscore. That easily creates a CSV file for upload, and then we can use the skeletal file upload tools in Symbiota to get those metadata populated. The other option where you just create a completely blank record would be to capture all those images and just rename them based on the barcode values that are assigned to the specimen sheets. You upload those, and then excuse me, a script in Symbiota would then create completely blank records that only have the catalog number field populated with that barcode value. And then downstream from that, you could have student technicians either edit the records based on using the the edit existing records option in the data editor control panel. And that displays a full form, and you could tell your students just enter a certain number of fields or whatever, but basically they would zoom in on the specimen label because the image is already in there and flesh out the record that way. And some of the other options that we saw were folks taking advantage of these crowdsourcing modules that were available in Symbiota at the time. All right, next slide, please. So here's a more concrete example of how the image-only database would work. For example, if you took a picture of the Starship Enterprise here, you would name your file NCC 1701 underscore USS Enterprise. And then you would have your script sort of crawl through that file folder, look at these file names, and it would parse it out based on the underscore as a delimiter. All right, so next slide, please. All right, so data forward workflows would involve development of skeletal data records, and this is the sort of typical module that you might see in any Symbiota environment with a variety of fields that you can check off and add to the form here. And depending on how much information the curator wanted to capture at the point in time, those fields can be toggled on or off. All right, if you want to move forward, yeah. Okay, so spreadsheets, back to spreadsheets again, these would be used if you didn't have access to the imaging equipment or no network connection in the space where data were being captured. And one of the advantages to this, if you've ever used Excel, you can sort of click on a cell, drag, and it'll pre-populate the cells with whatever value you've put into that first cell. So this works particularly well if you have a pre-digitization scheme where you've filed things with like a color-coded folder that codes for a geographic designation and that sort of thing. And limits the amount of information that students have to type in. That's going to cut down on keystroke errors and really speed up the data entry or data development process. And then, of course, any additional fields that you want to include at the time can also be done. This would then go into the skeletal file upload module within a Symbiota environment. And the beauty of this is that if you already have a record in there and you didn't realize it, it's not going to overwrite any of the existing data. It's only additive. All right. Now, the skeletal data entry directly in the portal, again, this is one that we kind of listened to our project partners that had already endeavored on these things in Louisiana and Mississippi. And we identified certain fields that would be sort of essential. Of course, the Darwin Core requisite field is that catalog number, or any of the other sort of upper geography we thought was particularly important to capture. Anyway, so yes, and then we also included this timer to manage the productivity. And again, I don't like to place too much emphasis on that because now it does tend to sort of freak out my students if they see that they're taking a long time to get this stuff done. One of the cool things that this module does is that it keeps a log of the specimens that have been entered. So it allows the person who's working in that environment to quickly access a specimen record that they've added and make any edits on the fly. Say they missed a field that was carried forward or something was carried forward in an error from one record to the next, and they needed to fix that. And they can easily click on one of the hot links next to the logged specimen records and make those changes accordingly. All right, I think we can advance, yeah. Michael, your turn.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Eric. I'm just going to talk for a minute here about one of the other tools that we developed as part of the TCN, and that was what's called the Notes from Nature import tool. Just to give a little background, Notes from Nature is a citizen science site that we used extensively for this project, but other people outside of SERNEC use Symbiota and Notes from Nature, so we just thought we'd take a minute to highlight this. So basically, we used it for transcription, outreach, and some educational uses. But I think one of the important things to point out here is that Notes from Nature typically collects multiple replicates. So you get Like, for example, the most common thing we do is get three different users, and then we reconcile that. It's actually done by field, not the whole record, but you reconcile the field, and then you basically get your sort of best answer based on those three different things. So the sort of final answer is not one user, but it's the sort of combination of the three based on what our algorithm has determined. And just to show you, oops. Oh, can you go to the next slide, please? So just a kind of quick overview of this, what this kind of looks like is you have this number one, two, three as rows in this sort of table, and then the yellow at the top is the output. And so you can see, like for example, at the top we have the country and user one. That's their username, P Verbeek. They said Canada. The next user said Canada and the third user said Canada. So we get a unanimous record, three of three matches, and that gives you your answer. So just we don't need to get too into this right now, but just want to make sure people are aware that it's a little different in terms of how it's done, and how the data comes back to you. Next slide. So if you look under there, there's quite a few of these in the administrative control panel. There's different kinds of importers. So you'll see that notes from nature import there, kind of in the middle where the gray arrow is. And what commonly will happen the first time you do this, and a lot of you are already familiar with how this kind of works, but it wants you to sort of verify um, the mappings. And so basically, I'm showing you on the right here just where I was checking and kind of cross-referencing the which field I wanted, which source field matched which target field in Symbiota. And then below that, you can see the processing status, which you could set to any number of different things, but we actually have a notes from nature pending review status. That actually may or may not be the one you want to choose, as I think we've talked about a lot. These processing statuses are sort of defined within your collection of how you use them. So, for consistency, but you could choose that, and that has a certain meaning for your group, and you choose that that processing status to assign to that bulk upload of those records. Next slide. So the main advantages of this uploader, because it's somewhat similar to the others, but I think it allows you to fine tune the processing status, so you can have basically different categories of records. And there's a couple reasons why you might do this, and I'll talk about that in a second. An example of what some people are doing right now with this sort of thing. Um, it allows additional field mappings to be saved. So, for example, say you have, your notes from nature data is a little different than some of the other data you tend to import. Then you can have multiple kinds of, field mappings that are kind of saved by default. So that can be quite handy, save you some time. And then making multiple uploads, I'm sorry, making uploading to multiple collections easier. So, what was fairly common with notes from nature with people would basically grab specimens across multiple collections for efficiency. So say, you're doing sunflowers of Tennessee, you might want to choose multiple collections to pull those records from rather than just one, just University of Tennessee. You might want to include Chattanooga or East Tennessee State or something as well in that expedition. So this helps you manage that a little bit better, makes it a little bit easier for you to do that. And I can, talk to people on the side about kind of the details of that, but it just made it a little bit easier for people to not get confused and be able to upload things to different collections a little bit easier. And I put this little screenshot at the bottom here because I wanted to kind of just make another point about how people are kind of fine tuning how they manage this data. This is actually some sex related data from, these are not plant specimens, but I had this at hand. This data I was just working on recently, but we can process the data with what's called explanations. And so when you get the data, you can have this basically this column which says, well, how did I get this answer? And so, you can see in this one very common, the exact match unanimous, three of three. We have one that's exact match, but it's only two of three. And so one of the people I'm working with right now on a project, what they like to do is right as soon as they get the data from Notes of Nature, They basically, I process it with the explanations. They take all the unanimous matching records that have all unanimous matches, and they just put them right into the system. So they just say, we've been really happy with these. We know there's extremely high likelihood that we're getting the correct answer, and we don't want to waste time. We want to get this data out there. So they'll grab those records, set them immediately to basically upload and to into the live database, and then maybe they might take the others and do different things with them, or maybe they'll examine some of those other ones closer. I would argue, just as an aside, that using 3 of 3 might be a little overly conservative. Like, I mean, 2 of 2 with an exact match is probably quite good too. But again, that's very much a personal decision that people want to use for what works for their collections. But for me personally, that's I think you're still going to probably get some really good results even from things that are, for example, 2 of 3. But in any case, just wanted to give you a little more about why you might choose these different, separate the uploads or choose different processing statuses would be reasons like this, where there's stuff you want to get out there, there's other things you really want to review, and this gives you some of that flexibility. So I think that's really useful to a lot of Symbiota users. I think that's it for me, but let's go net one more. Okay, yeah, we're back to Herrick.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, as far as continued successes with the SERNEC project and post-funding activity, we've had 3 Penn grants. Those are listed there. I think the last one, Southern Illinois, wrapped up at the end of last year. However, we've continued to add additional collections beyond the scope of that, all of these projects. And I don't know if back at one of the earlier slides, we had a target in the initial proposal of about 107 herbaria. I think when we really hit the ground running, we might have had more on the order of 90 something or so. But a quick check of the stats in the SERNEC portal shows that we have about 147 collections assigned to the SERNEC category. And so a lot of those have just sort of been onboarded by folks finding out about the potential to upload their data to that environment through various conferences and those sorts of things, and then reaching out to Symbiota Support Hub or myself or Michael or anybody, and we kind of get the dialogue started and manage to onboard those collections as quickly as possible. So it's really been kind of a cool thing, seeing that momentum continue beyond the scope of having dollars to support the work. Some of the other things that we've done is continue to develop data. So the initial push following our notice of being awarded funds was to capture a lot of skeletal data. And now we're kind of in a more mature phase where those skeletal records are in need of being sort of fleshed out. So that's an ongoing project. I still have students that work for me that are doing these sorts of things. And then I've also, at a more personal level, but I think some of you others, curators out there, have probably started dialogues with state heritage programs or other sorts of stakeholders and that sort of thing to find new ways of making the data more compatible with other environments. And so that sometimes revolves around these discussions that lead to not data standards in the sense of Darwin core standards, but how would you enter a collector's name into the collector's field? Are you going to do that first name last or last name comma first? Those sorts of things. So if we can go to the next slide, I think I got some more stuff to talk about now in terms of challenges. Yeah, so the budget, one of the greatest things is, third time being the charm. We're like, yay, we finally did it. And the early communication from NSF was, yeah, this is a great project. We'd like to support it, but can you cut your budget by about 30%? And so that kind of did precipitate some of these early changes in the strategy to how we were going to go about digitizing things, the numbers of specimens that would be in the scope of the project, and did indeed lead to some of the adaptability that we had to adopt in our strategies for digitizing things. So that's sort of workflows that came about early on were more suggested and optimized in an ideal world, and then we kind of had to embrace reality and pivot on a dime to kind of accommodate collections that were struggling as a result of having to reduce the budget. One of the things that we did, one of the communications that we received early on, and I cannot remember if this was in the initial RFP with the ADBC program or if we spoke to a PO or one of the reviewers' comments, but they suggested that focusing on skeletal data development should be the priority, not having data perfect upfront before you publish it. And the idea being there is that it probably would not get published ever if it was waiting to be perfected, and that by publishing skeletal data or imperfect data would allow it to be honed and reviewed, scrutinized, and used and perfected by the community at large. So in some cases, one of the things that we sort of found challenging was working with some collections that were kind of hanging on to the data because they didn't think they were quite perfect enough to be published, and convincing them that it was okay to go ahead and get those data out there. So again, I think we spoke about different ways that we've tried to adopt new strategies dealing with data entry and development, depending on the circumstances of individual collections. We did have a cool deal going for a while with iPlant that then had an identity crisis and morphed into Cyverse, and they were our sort of storehouse for images for a long time there. That has since been renegotiated quite successfully, I think, working with the Support Hub and Arizona State. And one of the bigger things, and this was a tool that we supported the development of, was the community georeferencing platform that integrates in real time with geolocate. And the idea there was that we could create this sort of another sort of citizen science interface where batches of specimens could be queued for georeferencing. And then the tools in that environment have biogeomancer. You can basically drop a pin on a map to get coordinates assigned to similar records that have similar localities, those sorts of things. I think we had a few projects that got some traction within that environment, but not to the extent that we were hoping. So next slide, please. All right, I think I spoke to this a bit. So we're at least over 40 new collections that are beyond the initial scope. We've exceeded our target of specimen digitization by over 1 million, which is pretty exciting. I think in terms of student involvement within the project, we averaged about 200 a year. I think in terms of individual students, it might have been a little over 300 individuals. And then, of course, some of these are still stuck in this loop of specimen digitization even after getting graduate degrees and moving on. Some of the spinoffs and other products that were precipitated from the project were a few symposia and colloquia at regional and national meetings. Of course, and Michael could speak to the sort of volume of involvement with Notes from Nature projects, but just a snapshot of some of those from We Dig Bio transcription events. I know that there were like 24,000 transcriptions in a week's time or something like that. So it gets a lot of involvement from the community. Last slide. So, and I think within the SERNEC community, I've had discussions, I know, with Zach and Michael on again, off again, about future ideas and how we can add something new to the SERNEC project. And I've probably spoken with other individuals in separate conversations about different project ideas. But I think first and foremost, if we're aiming for some sort of completeness, would be to kind of try to find those 86 remaining out of the 233 herbaria in the southeastern U.S. and see about mobilizing their data or what their status is and whether or not they can be digitized. Of course, we want to maintain activity, especially in the state level consortia, because that was one of the strong suits that we had. Was it was sort of a distributed network where we had lead PIs within various states, and this largely was because it was such a big geographic area that managing the digitization of so many collections sort of required a hub and spoke model. So we'd have a few lead PIs in each state, and they would work with the other participating institutions to help them get digitized. In a lot of cases, we had mobile imaging units that were sort of dedicated to go, rove around the state, helping to digitize some of the smaller collections, and then a few dedicated stations at some of the larger institutions. And of course, we also want to continue to share new ideas or new methods that are developed, and that can be born out of things like state level consortia. I think in terms of the concerns that different heritage programs might have within the states and other nuanced budgetary concerns or other issues of concern within that large region tend to be sort of better managed than like maybe a state level hierarchy. Of course, we want to continue encouraging collaboration with our stakeholders. So again, I keep a close open dialogue with our heritage program folks that are involved in botany. Native plant societies can also be a big help. These can be particularly useful for notes from nature transcriptions or other sorts of things that might be more familiar at the state level or at even a sub-state level. Reaching out to federal units. This is a question that I've had for a while. I know that some of our project partners had agreements up front to work with some of the national parks properties within the region. I've since had a few conversations with some that are in South Carolina here, and those can be sort of challenging as well because where the funding comes from and who actually is the owner of those collections and those sorts of things become things that need to be negotiated. And of course, we want to continue to reach out to K-12 schools and expand and develop more educational materials that can get students learning about plants earlier, and I guess integrate with whatever state level standards that may be out there. Of course, like I said earlier, we have a lot of skeletal data that needs a little bit of flesh added to it. Some of the other things that we've talked about are concept mapping and developing our georeferencing integration a little bit better. And then one thing that I'm really interested in is looking more closely at associated taxa, the extensions of these digital specimens, and this duplicate linking within the Symbiota environment. And all of those can help us find new ways of supporting salient research projects that might go beyond just the traditional herbarium collection. And where are we? Is that the end? That's all I got. I'm open for questions, whatever else.
I have a question, you guys.
Go for it, Jen.
Where are you guys posting and maintaining all of your stuff? Is that on the SERNEC.org?
So I don't know if that domain name exists anymore.
Well, it does redirect to the Appalachian State website.
Okay, cool. So if that's the case, yeah, then it is on the App State site, and we have the documentation. Might have to dig a little bit in there, but it is buried in there. Now at this point,
protocols are in there, and that's
yes, but those may be a little bit dated at this point in time. Mm-hmm. So.
There's a question. Oh, there's a question in the chat from Brian.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Frank.
Okay, so actually, it's not a question.
Hold on, Frank. You sound like a robot. Can you switch between microphones, maybe?
Am I better
Oh,
now?
yeah, way
Yes.
better.
Okay, sorry. So I know I have always this trouble with the microphone on Zoom for whatever reason. Anyway, so I just thought I wanted to give some compliments for doing all that, and I wanted to also mention that for the global grant we developed a program that during image capture can generate a CSV file, so a spreadsheet file with skeletal metadata, and it's called BCR Watcher. It's a strange name. VCR was the barcode renamer, and now this program does an additional step. It not only scans the file for a barcode, but it also allows you, while it's doing that, to move the file from one directory, from one folder into another one, renaming those files and generating a spreadsheet with all these fields that you call skeletal metadata. And you can actually configure that, decide what kind of metadata you want to capture during this process. And so I put in the chat a link to that site where you can find the program. So you might know that the Lichen Consortium has a support website, and on that support website, you can find that program. So it's something you might want to try out. It's kind of potentially can avoid having to run some scripts and doing some weird naming convention of adding all that data to your files. It's basically you take a picture, program pops up with a box of data entry, and then you can capture skeletal data relatively rapidly. So just wanted to mention that anyways.
Cool. Frank, can I ask you too, does that also simultaneously add metadata to the image file? Did you say that?
Yes, actually, if you enable these boxes, so there's a, I mean, if you allow me to share the screen, I can quickly show you what the program looks like.
I think you should have the ability to.
Okay. Yes. So the program, so this is the website. It's called BCR Watcher. So you can go to likenportal.org and then the help thing. Anyway, so that's what the program looks like. So basically, while you're taking pictures with your camera, the program watches a folder where the images are being dropped from your camera. And then it scans for a particular barcode format. And there are currently two barcodes that the program recognizes. And you have to tell it, okay, it has a prefix and it has so many digits afterwards. And then it renames the files, but it will also write this to a CSV file. And at the same time, it will create for the raw files and a sidecar file, writing that metadata, and it will write the data into the JPEG file as well. And there's a way to select which fields you want to use. And so there's a bunch of those fields, and we can add more if anybody is interested. So for example, the scientific name, the collection date, state, province, and so forth. So I'm not sure if I've got anything in that folder, but you basically click, say the camera was connected, click the watch button. And in this case, it says it's found something in that folder. And so now it's scanning for the barcode, and that image doesn't have a barcode, but you can see how this would happen. You could then add all the metadata here. And when you do that, and you press continue, then a CSV file, don't do that now, but a CSV file is generated, and also that information is written to that image file.
Frank, may I ask, that's PC only, right? Do you know if there are any plans
Yeah.
to be
That's PC only. I mean, Daryl is a volunteer programmer who wrote that program. And so he is a PC guy. And if anybody wants to or can transcribe it in, and it's written on CC++, which is a pretty common programming language. And all the programs that he writes are in CC++. So maybe somebody can make that work for a Mac. And I'm more than happy to share that if anybody does that. So.
very cool? Thanks for sharing that.
A question from Brad in the chat. Has SERNEC been exploring any AI transcription methods? Could you comment on your thoughts on integrating AI?
Eric, you want to take that?
Uh, well, no. Um, no, I don't know that we have. I mean, I think, and I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I know there's been some projects, I guess, that we're looking at something as maybe on the verge of like a uh, machine learning or something like that. But AI is no, I haven't. I don't think we've had any discussion like that.
Um, I can comment a little bit about, I mean, it's not a CERNEC project, but I've been involved with the DigiLeap project, which basically used, it's technically called a rule-based model in it ensembled with ChatGPT. Um, the issue that most people, had with that is that ChatGPT, you don't exactly know the cost. So I think for a lot of collections, there was some concern about throwing your credit card down and finding out at the end of the month what it was going to charge you. We didn't get a ton of engagement on that side. Now you could use our rule-based parsers and our tools for free, and it was totally open source. But the ChatGPT choice was made in some respects from community pressure that people felt that was the way to go, and then subsequently didn't really love it. So we're in the process of actually rebuilding DigiLeap with a new open AI model. And we have started writing the proposal, which I probably don't need to get into that, but we're probably, not sure what's going to happen with that proposal as far as NSF or, going elsewhere. But we're in the process of completely rewriting DigiLeap to use an open AI model instead of ChatGPT. But it's a much larger discussion. Sounds like some other people want to jump in on that.
Jen, is your comment on AI or is it a question? Okay. Mike?
Not sure how to approach this, but I was curious about, this is a large geographic area, how you organize yourselves, all of the herbaria, how you deal with herbaria in need. I'm a graduate of Duke University, for example. Don't know what's happening with them. Smaller herbaria, you mentioned the 86 herbaria that have yet to be digitized. What kind of umbrella organization do you have that's been successful to get everybody together in CERNEC? It's very impressive.
Yeah. So again, so the model, I mean, to back up a bit, when the proposal was submitted to NSF, they were using Fastlane, and I think it broke the system. I looked at it the other day, and the full proposal was like 600 pages because it included like all the collaborating institutions at the state level and subawards to each of those. So it was a very, very distributed collaborative proposal when it went in. The basic model was that we had sort of a lead institution, which was at App State University, with Zach Merle being the PI for the overarching project. And then there were basically state level lead PIs. In some cases, depending on the size of the state, that might have been just one lead PI, or it may have been a pair of PIs, typically at some of the larger institutions within that state. And then in terms of digitizing the smaller collections, some of the strategies involved would be packing up the entire collection and shipping it to one of the larger institutions that had all the equipment and workforce and that sort of thing. In other cases, we set up like mobile imaging units that would rove around the state on sort of a predetermined timeline, reaching out to those collections that otherwise could not afford or didn't have the budget to digitize through the entire 4-5 year period or so. So as far as during the project was while it was funded, that those were some of the strategies that we used to get the other collections involved. Of course, one of the great things about the Symbiota environment is that it doesn't require any local IT expertise. That it's all sort of online, and that was one of the biggest hurdles getting some of the smaller collections sort of mobilized. Was just overcoming the IT challenges. Now that funding is passed and we're still continuing to onboard some of these smaller collections, I found that in some cases, um, the collections managers or curators have actually secured internal funding from their home institution to acquire imaging equipment. In other cases, I think some collections have gotten some external funding, but it's just been sort of a piecemeal basis, which is sort of frustrating because if we were a little more organized and had these communications with these folks in the same sort of environment that we did during the RCN, I feel like we could like really organize these things into another Penn grant or that sort of thing, and take care of a lot of them at once instead of this sort of piecemeal approach that we're handling now. Does that answer your question
Yeah,
sufficiently?
partially. And just currently, kind of alluded to that. I guess, how you communicate with all the members. Do you have regular meetings? Is it something that um, you can do just with emails, so forth? How are
So,
you such a cohesive
Can I
unit?
can I say
yeah,
something about that, Eric?
yeah, go for it.
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that we're not, we're not as active now as we were, when
Yeah.
we had the sort of project was running. I think, I mentioned this because I think California has similarities. And Herrick mentioned it, we had some projects that sort of precursors to the TCN, and it's a pretty tight-knit community in the Southeast. And so I think we benefit a lot from having that community that was kind of in place and had been built. Um, I think we benefit a lot from having regional meetings like the Southeast biologist, that was called, Herrick, Southeastern biologist meeting, was sort of a regional meeting that a lot of people would go to anyway. So I think that that kind of stuff actually I think can really carry, for a long time when people have those relationships that have been built. And I think California has a lot of that as well. So I think that's been helpful. But I mean, we did try and have listservs and emails and regular meetings and all of those things. And I think those were valuable. But I want to mention that sort of soft part, which is that we had sort of built this community over several decades.
Hmm.
I'll add to that, and Michael, I apologize if I reiterate anything you just said. But yeah, that Society for Herbarium Curators was initially formed within the Southeast and grew to such a size through some of the other meetings that the SERNEC unit effectively formed the Southeastern chapter of SHC. And so through that forum, we do still tend to manage to keep some communication going, though it's not entirely project related.
Jen, you have a question?
Yeah, my question is along the same lines as Mike's, but maybe it's more specific. That gave me a lot to think about, and I'm going to stew on that for a while because it's a real problem in all of these communities. Like everybody is strong when the funding is there, and then how do you sustain that? Like what is the necessary component of having somebody who can even just maintain an email listserv, like that is not a small task either. And it's important for people to be able to communicate. So anyway, thinking about that, but I'm wondering if you guys have figured out any way of um, updating your protocols and staying on top of it. Like during a TCN, everybody's sort of like, here's our protocols, and everybody's doing the work. And then at some point, it begins to diverge. Like our barcode supplier went away. The light box maker went away. So, like, what's the next light box? What's the next barcode? And have you guys managed to try to stay on top of that? And who's actually doing that work within SERNEC?
I mean, not as organized since the project has ended. I think it's been more like someone might reach out to Herrick and I, and then we say, "Hey, this is like we heard now this is a good alternative," or I mean, Hera can jump in, but I think it's a little more on demand now, um,
Mhm.
than it was previously.
Yeah, I guess at
Yeah.
least they know to reach out to you as the
Well,
hub.
we have well SCDNR and USCH has been doing the SC consortium meetings, which are open. We regularly invite everybody in SERNEC. So if you're seeing those meeting invites, that comes from us. But one thing that we have talked about in those meetings, and so I keep on putting this out there, if anybody has any thoughts or ideas about it, is getting some of the protections for for these herbaria, getting them legislative protections. So like legal protections, trying to get them to become state repositories. So there is funding for this kind of keeping them alive and keeping the communication alive. So they can't just be tossed in the trash. Obviously, that wouldn't work for privately funded herbaria. I guess this is more targeted towards the herbaria that are universities that are part of the state of South Carolina. I mean, this is something we would love to happen. It hasn't actually moved forward yet. So, any thoughts, opinions, or ideas would be great. But apparently, Florida had also explored this avenue as well of trying to push that. And so then maybe they do get that kind of sort of protection. There could be protocols set in place by the state.
Yeah. I'll be remiss if I don't mention, put this in the chat. So at USCH, um, well, I have actually can't take the credit for this. I have to owe it to Chilla and Avery and my team of my dream team of workers here. But they've worked hard to kind of document our standards for data entry. A lot of these are derived and adapted from the SERNEC protocols. But basically, the thing that they help us do is manage a lot of student volunteers, because training is always a time consuming issue. And with a quick reference guide on imaging and those sorts of things, it can help a lot. So we have a number of PowerPoints and PDFs available that y'all can borrow. And again, these are sort of a little more up to date. Um, but yeah, Jen, you speak to the sort of the changing landscape of these projects and how the technology changes and companies go bankrupt or just out of business, and then we're kind of left wondering, what are we going to do? The sole provider of this piece of equipment is no longer producing it. And so what I've been relying on largely is I guess the herbarium listserv, other sorts of listservs, is just putting these feelers out there to see how folks have adapted. Some folks are a little newer in the game of digitizing, and they've had to like kind of start fresh with what's available at the time that they're beginning their digitization endeavors. And a lot of cool ideas have come out of that, and a lot of really detailed responses in terms of like, what do you do if you can't buy a 50 millimeter macro lens to fit your camera anymore? And what's the next best solution? But I don't have the time to compile all that. And it's like there's this one-off answer to a random question that somebody's posted in that listserv. And um, yeah, I don't know how to manage it all. It's tough.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on what Jen had said, Herrick's answer, because we're the camera crisis, right? And Herrick and the listserv were very helpful, not with providing a solution yet. We haven't been able to, still third month in, trying to figure out how to solve the problem. And just since I'm staring right here at Michael Herrick and Zach's name aligned with my question in the chat, is nobody but me and four other colleagues who don't exist anymore are getting the NSF overdue reports email, I assume, because yeah, there are people who say it's not at our level and it's at the SERNIC level. And I'm like, No, we were all essentially separate grants. And the basic issue is, of course, all the institutions are abdicating responsibility. And so the things that went into the black hole and the chasm are just still there.
I love, Donna, that this is like, turn your reports in, guys.
Are you talking an annual report or the final report?
The final report, I believe, yes.
Well, I believe you, at the time, this is going back several years, but you needed to also, submit the consolidated report, I believe was what we were still doing that. So maybe you never submitted the consolidated report.
A
I mean, Zach
consolidated report.
there was we had to submit like collective information as well as your individual information. But Zach can speak to whether I'm not formally at App State, so I don't get any, of those notifications. Zach can maybe speak to whether there's still some outstanding stuff, but my impression was that there was not.
Can you hear me? This is
Yes.
Zach. For some reason I can't get my video to work, but Donna, I am tasked with the issue you're talking about. It's on my to-do list. It's not clear to me how that ball got dropped, but it did, and so that's something I need to clear up.
Okay. I've been ignoring the twice a month emails for several years. I will continue to do that. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, we are over the hour, and I want to respect everyone's time and also give enough time to thank our wonderful SERNEC friends for chatting with us about the great project that you guys put on. I know it was a huge effort, and thanks for sharing about all those cool tools and workflows and just all the work that it took to put it together.
Thank you, guys. It was awesome.
Yeah, thanks
Great
a lot.
overview.
Thanks so much.
See you next